trees, that, what's his name? Some of the Herodotus I think that was him in ancient Egypt, did some fantastically good mathematical work and came out to a size of the planet, which we now say is off by 0.1013%. Well, maybe it wasn't off by 0.13%, because if you use his same mathematics today, you get an accurate representation of the planet's size. And if he used that same formula, maybe the planet actually was smaller at his day than it is at ours. And there's all these various different examples, including physical geology, that point to the and support the idea of the planetary expansion model. And we see it on other planets as well. So, accepting moons, which is an interesting issue. But in any event, so at this point, I'm thinking that maybe what we're about to see is a modern, or is a human species living through an expansion event.
Well, and let's say one of those two theories are correct, or both potentially. How fast could we potentially see continents moving around? Is there any way to tell, or?
Sure, we actually have historical records. If you want to go into some of the French and Belgian translators of ancient, what we call Egyptian, but in fact is Atlantean records, we get a situation where we have people that have translated these records that are found in the western edge of Africa in sites that are no longer accessible by any of us because the powers that be control them. But you find temples and stuff that describe what it was like to go through the last crustal shift by the people that we call the Atlanteans. Okay, and their response was that it occurred thus. There's actually this really cool ancient text, and I'm trying to. There's a fellow in Europe that's sending me a copy, some pages out of a book. That the book is fantastically expensive, but he happened to have a copy, and he's sending me the original text, and I'm going to do my own translation of it. But
Right.
so far, I trust the translation I've been given. And that translation is from a sea captain that took he's actually more of a commodore because he controlled several boats, but he took a group of people, sailed them from what was Antarctica up to the Azores in the process of the last pole shift, and then when it was all done, he took all the survivors from the Azores and landed them on the western edge of Africa, and then they wrote their story down at some point and put it in these structures there commemorating everything. The structures also served dual duty because it looked like they were set up to determine what the new planting seasons were, the change in the orbit. There was a lot of math involved that seemed to suggest that they were dealing with a shift in a number of days in the orbit, which of course also goes to the expansion model. As an aside, as the Earth expands, it will alter our orbit, adding days as we go along for a variety of reasons we needn't get into. So it makes sense that we went from a 360-day orbital period to a 365.25
Right.
or period. Okay, so anyway, the description of this is as follows. They get on their boats, and it's about dusk. In their time period, about 5 hours of very disturbed, choppy seas threaten their fleet. In the fifth hour, the stars fall. By that, they mean that the stars go whizzing about in the sky in this big jerk that took about 45 minutes.
Wow.
So for about 45 minutes, they find themselves accelerating along with the wind. They have no control. These are sailboats. They can't steer unless they have greater speed than the winds and the waves in which they're in. And so they had no control, and they were just more or less bobbing along for about 45 minutes as all of the stars appeared to descend to the south, which meant that they were actually rotating to what we think of as the north. Then there was a period of quiescence that lasted also about 45 minutes, and then another great jerk. Then there was a period of quiescence that lasted for several hours, and then another smaller, lesser jerk, and they found themselves with the planet and basically the organization of the continents that we now have. And so it occurred in three separate jerks, not a smooth continuous motion. The jerks were violent. When you were in the middle of them, it was kind of okay, but when they started and stopped, it wasn't all that pleasant. But in the main, they did okay, and in the main, the guy was able to bring through most of his fleet. They had about 30 to 40% of the boats that were dismasted and made unmanageable and later on had to be towed. They lost a couple of boats, and they had a couple of boats that were swamped, and they were able to recover the people. All of this is detailed in their description of the events and all of that.
Well, fascinating stuff. So potentially we're all in for a heck of a ride here in the next couple of years, huh?
Uh, Certainly, we're not potentially. We will experience a hell of a ride. Whether we get to the point of a crustal shift is it's really hard to say because there are a couple of things we need to note. Okay. One of the things is that in 1947, the U.S. military had an expedition going down into Antarctica.
Okay.
At the same time that they had that expedition going, Admiral Byrd's expedition is, the same time that they had that expedition going down into Antarctica, which a lot of people were killed, by the way, and it was very mysterious and probably involved Nazi bases and all of that. But at the same time, they sent a bunch of people flying over the North Pole to try and determine the exact mathematical and magnetic position of the pole relative to the geographic pole.
Okay.
Okay, they did that to supply information to Admiral Byrd, but they also ended up with this interesting bit of information that came out of that. The interesting bit of information was that any time in our past that the magnetic pole and the geographic pole lined up exactly, we have had a crustal shift. Okay, this is information that Hapgood did not have. He had some of it, but he didn't have the confirmatory stuff that came out of the military. So, because that's the case, because we can say with certainty that the U.S. military has stated internally and is operating on the idea from 1947 that the magnetic North Pole meeting the physical geographic North Pole equals crustal shift, we may be in a situation now where it might be feasible due to energetic influences from HARP and the Russian version, which is called Woodpecker, and the Chinese version of these Tesla technologies, it may be possible that the powers that be are steering the North Pole, trying to keep the magnetic North Pole away from the physical North Pole over these next couple of years. And then we can say to ourselves, well, what would be some of the influences that we might see, some of the side effects, if that were the case? Well, we might see such things as, because they're doing it with energetic waves that come from these multiple Tesla devices scattered around the planet, and these waves are denser in a sense than our other ordinary waves, because they're trying to push the magnetism of the planet around, they have to be equal to that task, so to speak, right? Even though they're using leverage and so on, they still have huge amounts of energy involved.
Right.
Well, one of the side effects of that you could postulate would exist would be strange fish kills as this wave of energy went through water, or birds falling out of the sky.
Which we've seen both of, huh? It just started happening.
Or even might be strange, rhythmic, atypical, almost artificial looking earthquake swarms, where instead of a swarm, it's the same damn spot every hour and 1 minute, or every 28 minutes, or something along those, so that they would have a defined fixed periodicity that is not normally seen in nature. So one might speculate that indeed that's what's occurring, given how the Earth has changed over these past couple of years, or past decades. We might actually speculate that the powers that be are currently involved with their technologies trying to prevent this, because they got a good cushy thing going and they don't want to lose it. They've got all these slaves out there working in cubes for them to supply them wealth and adoration and all of that, and they like it, so they might actually want to keep at that, and so they might do a lot to try and prevent a giant crustal shift. And this would also answer the question that everybody in the alternative media side has been asking. Well, why, if there's going to be a giant cataclysm in 2012, would the powers that be try and engineer a mass die-off?
Right.
Well, it would make sense if they wanted population control to have selective population control, and they would want to engineer a mass die-off to get rid of what they've defined as the useless eaters, and only keep those of us that they can manipulate and suck the blood out of, right?
Right.
And they would do that if they were trying to also engineer that the crustal shift didn't happen. Another thing about the crustal shift part of this, if indeed, as I'm postulating here, our energetic universe and our toroid that is the Mother Earth is receiving extra energy from the sun, and it converts that to matter, one of the things that humans in power might try and do would be to say,